Why this exhibit? I found it in 2016, well actually 2015, the Irma McClaurin Black Feminist Archive. And it is an archive that is dedicated to making Black women visible and heard. And so it is a collection of papers, artifacts at the University of Massachusetts Amherst in the W.E.B. Du Bois Library, which has Du Bois's papers in it, so it's in good company. They have 99,000 items of W.E.B. Du Bois. And so I feel that the collection is in very good company. My hope is that I will also have a McClaurin Black Feminist Archive Center soon. The university just hired a Black archivist specifically for my collection. And so they're my papers, but they're also about 8 or 9 other women. Edjo, who is Belize, the country of Belize's only internationally published author. People like Mae Upperman, who was a woman who, her friend called and said, my friend collects books. And I said, we probably have the books, but then the more we started talking to Mae, it turns out she was a self-taught artist. Turns out she was connected to people. Her uncle was very prominent in the civil rights movement. And so the more that we started talking, we began to uncover the layers. And so when I met Bobby C. Jr., one of the things he talked about was his mother's hats. And I thought, wow, that's really cool. And then he told me that he had like about 30 boxes. I think there were about 30 or 40 boxes. And so I had a chance to start going through them and started taking photographs of them. And what I discovered was this, not only just that this was someone who made hats, but this was an artist. And I think that's one of the things that we don't think about when we think about milliners. I had a chance to meet another Black milliner in Amherst, Massachusetts when I went there. So to see Black women making hats is not just about the technique and the skill, but it's also about the artistry, and I think you see that in Mrs. Williams' hats. The Atlantic. They stripped and shackled us like animals. No clothes except bare minimum. Nothing on our heads to block the sun when they occasionally allowed us on deck to breathe fresh air. They forced us not to speak to each other lest we might plot, escape from unity. And then we were here, in the Americas, in places with names like Plateau, Alabama, Magazine, Alabama, and now Africatown, Alabama. You may shame the body, you may silence people's languages and force them to learn a new foreign tongue, but you cannot shackle the mind and spirits they carry inside. We had no belongings, but we had wisdom and knowledge tucked away, knowledge of adornment, knowledge of resistance. Even if we never tried to escape, we found other ways to protest and resist. We are a beautiful people. And I hope you know who those folks are. Anybody want to guess?
So German.
Yes, ma'am. All right. And of course, we're in their head ties, right? 2, in the fields daily, cotton stuck in the air. We toiled in the kitchen daily, domestics elbow deep in dirty dishes and diapers and somebody else's babies. We toiled. Tired, silent, an anger storm brewing at the disrespect we endured. But when Sunday finally came, we didn't rest. Instead, we gathered our pride that we quietly tucked away to survive and rallied it to praise the Lord as the Bible dictates. Quote, and this is from the person who did the book's crown, which you saw up there. It's out of print, but you can still get a copy. The person who did the book's crown, they wrote, when the Apostle Paul wrote an open letter to Corinthians, 1 Corinthians 11:5, decreeing that a woman cover her head when at worship to symbolize her obedience to God and the church hierarchy, he could not imagine the flamboyance with which African American women would comply. For generations, Black women have interpreted Apostle Paul's edict with boundless passion and singular flair, wearing platter hats, lampshade hats, why do you have to sit in front of me hats? You know those ones. Often with ornaments that runneth over, and that's in that book, Crowns. Sunday, the Sabbath, was our special day, a time to shake off fatigue, a time to praise the Lord, a time to lift the head and sing to the glory, wearing a crown. Different from the kitchen kerchiefs, stylish crowns decked out with feathers, pearls, lace, netting, sequins, on Sunday, Black women have adorned themselves with beautiful headgear, lest we forget how hard we toiled in fields and kitchens, and still toil in offices and institutions brimming over with microaggressions and oppression. We adorn ourselves with elegant hats on dignified heads held high above the weekly assaults and disrespect that have become routine in Black women's lives. On Sunday, Miss Susie Mae Pugh-Williams stood as a woman of faith to honor God with bowed head and elegant crowns. For as James Baldwin reminds us, our crowns have been bought and paid for. All we have to do is wear them. Make no mistake, on the days that Black women displayed attitude, every Sunday at the very least, the knowledge that we once were African queens, warriors, village healers, African mothers who still mourn the children stolen from them and sent on slave ships to the Americas. And we here in the African diaspora are the descendants of those children. On attitude days, whether it's Sabbath or any day of the week, pride is evident in the wide grams, the elegant feathers and sequins, the elaborate head wraps that whisper the secrets of African headwear, taken from us but still ingrained in our memories. In attitude moments, Black women reign with elegant grace and dignity, wearing a crown of their choosing. Think Harriet Tubman, think Sojourner Truth, think Zora Neale Hurston, think Erykah Badu, think Lauryn Hill, think your grandmother, think the mothers of the church, think your own mother, think yourself. Whatever your crown of choice, head ties, headwear, headgear, do-rags, poofies, bandanas, whatever you choose, flaunt it, head held high like the queens we are. Hats off to each and every Black woman, past, present, and future. Be the phenomenal woman. Sister Maya Angelou knew we were, and remember, always, our crowns have been bought and paid for. All we have to do is wear them. What I want to do is just talk a bit about some of the things that I found when I was doing this research. And that was that there has been, and this is one example, this young man was asked to cut off his dreadlocks before he could finish the competition. And what we've begun to see is this assault on Black women and hair. This is not new. As you probably saw in the program that we wrote, in the 1700s, Louisiana actually had what they called the Chigan law, the Tigon law. And what it required was that Black women cover their hair. And it didn't matter if they were free or enslaved. And the purpose was to make sure that people understood their low social status. So free Black women were required to cover their heads in what was called tignon, we call it a chignon, right? Pull it back in a little ball. What they didn't expect was that Black women then sort of turned it on its head and made it into an adornment. They started decorating it with beads and feathers, and the next thing you know, a law that was supposed to suppress us became the latest fashion statement. And it is reported that one of the queens actually started wearing the tignon, okay? So one of the things that I wanted to do was to talk about, Mrs. Susie Mae Pugh, the fact that her hats not just are about creativity and elegance, but they're also, and reverence, but they're also about resilience. That how we have managed to take things that have been turned against us, right, and make them into something new. Now, how many of you remember the 1960s and the Black Power movement, right? When we started wearing, there is Lauryn Hill and a do-rag, right? That's myself, I've got many, many styles. These are me at different times. This is really old. This is back when I did my field work in Belize in 1991. And then I did recently an article for the American Anthropological Association, and they took a photograph, and the person did an illustration of it, but always finding some way to do the hair. This exhibit is unique. There are not that many exhibits of Black women's hats. We have the one hats off to Mae Reeves, and how many of you know who Mae Reeves was? Her hats are now in the National Museum of African American History and Culture. So this exhibit actually started off with me calling it Hats Off to Susie Mae Pugh-Williams. And then, but I didn't know about this exhibit, and so then her son suggested a different name, and then between him, the name he suggested, and Stan, we came up with, I think, Timeless Hats, you know, and really trying to get this sense of elegance and artistry and creativity in it. This one, Black Women in Church Hats, exploring the history of Black women's church hats, and Fashion and Faith, which is about hats during the Great Migration. So there are about 4 or 5, but they're not that many. So this exhibit actually ends up being unique in the sense that it's probably one of the few in the South, because most of these have taken place in the Northeast, right? So we're sort of making history right here with this exhibit, which I'm proud to say. And then, of course, we see the way in which it has become part of popular culture. If you want to know how to make Erykah Badu's head tie, there's actually a YouTube on it. It takes a lot of fabric and a lot of time, but it's possible. And I think what's interesting is showing the way in which, in some ways, she is sort of mimicking Nefertiti, you know, the queen that she is. And of course, Lauryn Hill, who we all love her music. And so one of the things that comes to me is, what is it about us that makes people want to regulate who we are, our fashion, our hair, and hair in particular, because there are myths that Black women's hair is magical, right? And so people want us to cover it, cut it, not wear it natural, do anything but what it's supposed to do. And so I wondered if you had questions for me about this.
Well, my question, I don't think it's a question, it's just a statement as it pertains to African Americans. But the first thing I think about is that as a class of status, because I think about the Frisian cap, there was a symbol of freedom, and that even Lady Liberty wears a Frisian cap. And so, even though this is part of the African American experience, those kind of hats have signified resistance, because that red hat was always a symbol during the French Revolution.
I did research in Suriname, and what I discovered was that the head ties that women did, I had a little cloth head tie that someone had given me. It was a way for them to communicate. Okay, so how they tied their head tie was actually a way to message, either to their friends or to their lovers. It would say, I can't meet today. Okay, so this is like a sign of, just in the same way that Black women wove messages about freedom and the route to freedom in the quilts. Head ties became messages as well. You know, so the fact that we're able to take this fabric, you know, and make it into something that it was not intended to be, to me is like part of that sense of resilience that people have, that we continuously display, you know, in that respect. And I think the interesting thing about the Tignon law was that it was really white women in Louisiana who felt that mulatto women were sort of becoming too uppity, and some of them could pass, and so they felt like they were competition, and so they insisted, even if you're free, you need to wear this so people will know you're not really white, you know, that you're not the same status as we are. And again, they flipped it on the head. And that's something that I think we continuously do. And for me, preserving this kind of stuff, either in terms of the papers, art, you know, designs and things, but also in terms of the artifacts, becomes really important for us to tell our history and to recognize that it has value. Because I think too often we believe that these things people do, oh, that's nice and fine, but is it worthy And what we're seeing with some of these exhibits that have gone on is that, yes, it is worthy because it's telling us stories, you know, about the past, but also about the present. And it gives us an indication of how someone's mind works. You know, what were the kinds of things, what I find interesting is that lots of people take sort of, there's a standard kind of stovetop hat, and they decorated styles. But when you look at Mrs. Susie Pugh-Williams' hats, they're different styles. There's artistry. My favorite one is the rose that we had on the invite. But there's a silver one in there that's really beautiful. And there's a white one that if I were ever getting married again, heaven forbid, that's beaded with a little sort of loop to it. And it's like, that's a beautiful hat. And so what strikes me is not just the fact that she made them, but the versatility, the vision that she had to make these unique styles.
My question is, did she sketch these hats out first before she actually made them?
Well, Mr. Williams Sr. is back there. We don't have any sketches with Mr. Williams. Did she sketch it all, or did she just do them? No, she just started cutting and putting them together. I have a friend in Belize who did the same thing. She was not a trained seamstress, but she was able to make fashion. And she taught herself, and she could look at you, and she would just measure and tell you how much fabric she needed. And people would come in. I was amazed because in Belize at the time I was there, seamstresses were making, they were making wedding dresses for like $12. People would come in like with a butterwork book and say, I want this bottom, I want this top, I want it to look like this. And they would do it because people felt that handmade stuff was not as highly valued as ready-made. So at night, she would make ready-made stuff. She had a label called Fabiana. She put it on the rack, and people would pay more for that than they would pay to have her actually hand design, you know, these dresses. And she could do it. She had learned to just measure by eye how much fabric. She'd measure you and stuff, and then she cut without a pattern. And they were all unique. You know, so one of the things I did in my field work is that I worked as a seamstress in her shop. You know, and that got me an opportunity. I went to a vocational high school, so I was trained to be a secretary, and we had to take home back and learn how to sew as well. So in college, that's what I did. I sold most of my clothes. In 24 hours, I could make them lots of pants. Everybody else went to the store. I didn't have the money, so I learned, you know, I used my sewing skills in that sense. But the sketches, I think, being able to keep that in your mind then is just, I think, quite extraordinary. And so, you know, for me, the 60s and the Black nationalist movement was the one that brought the afros, but also began to get people to wear turbans or head ties, gaylays, and so it's sort of coming back. And I think now with, I wanted to say that we had the Tignon law in Louisiana in the 1700s, the laws against what fabric and clothing, black, that included head ties, headwear, was from South Carolina, also in the 1700s. But now we have the Crown Act, where black women are trying, and some states have signed on to it, are trying to make sure that people cannot be offered a job, and then when they walk in with dreadlocks, and my son has dreadlocks down to his knees, so I'm very sensitive to that. When people walk in with their natural hair, that they're told that the offer has been rescinded, and that is happening. And that's not recent. In 1995, I was at the University of Florida and got a call from someone, a lawyer, who wanted to see if I could do sort of a cultural assessment. And this was a guy who worked at UPS, who wore dreadlocks, and they were telling him that he needed to cut his hair in order to keep his job. And it's like, what does his hair have to do with driving the truck, right, or loading the parcels? And he was in an environment where his white colleagues had long hair, or in ponytails, or they were colored blue or green or whatever. That was not a problem. It was his hair in its natural form that was problematic, you know. And I remember, you know, trying to do this cultural assessment at that point. So the kinds of things that we're seeing, this young man, this, you know, that I pointed to, that was a recent, that has only been there. Yeah, that was just like recently. 2 years, yeah.
I have two more questions. Did she make any hats for children?
I don't know. No.
Okay. And my other question is, did wearing hats hats for women bring a status to a relationship? I don't know.
I'll let some of you elders answer
I
that.
don't know.
I think it is, I mean, I think this notion of respectability, if you go back and start looking at the turn of the century, and I think, I'm thinking of, not many people, who is the, Gordon Parks, but even before him, is it Vanderzee, who was a black photographer. I think if you start looking at some of his old photographs, that their, hats were a sign of sort of social status, that it was, because it's your Sunday best, and so people sort of dressed up, for that. So I think it did have some sense of social status, and when people would, how they would save money in order to buy like the best hat or save it for Easter. Easter is, of course, a hat day. That's a good hat day, and people will save their money so they can have the best Easter bonnet. And part of it is in the American culture in terms of Easter bonnet, but I think for black women in particular, it is this sense of elevating oneself, in that sense that, and again, I think about my mother who was, worked as a domestic and then later a cashier, but people would work and toil in jobs that were not very luxurious or very comforting, and certainly not ones that elevated them. And so Sunday was an opportunity for them to sort of shake that stuff off and elevate themselves, to present themselves as they knew themselves to be inside, to let the outside reflect that, because it didn't often, they weren't often in positions where they could do that. And I must say that, the policing of our hair, our clothes is still going on. I remember getting my teaching evaluations where they talked about my clothes. Not my teaching, but my clothes. And so, I've had many colleagues who talk about that, and I coach people to talk about how do you navigate that space when you're always under observation. Mine was that I never wore blue jeans. My colleagues could, but I knew if I wore blue jeans that there would be some kind of devaluing of me. So I had to be very conscious about how I dressed, how I presented myself, in that respect. I didn't expect for it to become sort of the thing about which they evaluated me, but that, that still happens. And I've talked to many young folks, who say that they've had that sense of being sort of under surveillance, that people are monitoring what they wear, how they wear things. Hair in the academia is not so much an issue, but certainly in sort of corporate world, it had become where people were actually being released from jobs because of how they wore their hair, in that sense. So the kind of laws that we think, which were sort of prohibited, there's still this kind of managing, of us and our bodies and our hair and our clothes in that sense. And so having the opportunity to sort of be big, and flaunt and be, to adorn oneself, to know that you're beautiful and elegant and that you deserve to show up like that, I think is really significant, in that respect. And that this exhibit, shows that. I know many of you would say, oh, I'd love to have that hat. As you walk through there, I certainly have seen many that I would love to say, I think I'd look kind of good in that. And I have a colleague of mine at the University of Washington. She has an Instagram where the students now look forward to her clothes because she sort of lays them out and puts pictures there, and she'll do head ties and things. But it's like an art, it's like a fashion, an art form. Now that she how she wears her clothes and things has become that. And I think part of it is that we're so often made to feel that we're invisible, that we want to be visible. We want to be seen, we want to be heard, we have a right to be. I go back to Baldwin's quote, and I had the honor of knowing James Baldwin, actually cooked for him. And I have about 52 photos of him that are in my archive, black and white photos that I took in the early 1980s when he used to come. He used to come every other year to the University of Massachusetts. And so I had a chance to sort of sit and listen to him. He was an extraordinary person. But as he says, we've paid the price. And it reminds me of the quote from Martin Luther King, who just says that, you know, America owes us, you know, a debt, that it has a check that hasn't been cashed yet. And I think that is something that, how we see ourselves, how we present ourselves is always something that we have to be conscious of, you know. And I think for when we can do it in such a wonderful and positive way, and, you know, I think the young girls, I think that's why the fascinator thing has taken on, that people see it as a different way to present. And I'm seeing a lot of young Black women, you know, who sort of get dressed up at a certain time with little fascinators. That's become like the big thing now. So that's become very interesting to see and watch. Yes?
Do you have the first hat she ever made, or?
It's known because she didn't date the boxes. There's no way to tell. But I don't know, Mr. Williams.
I don't know, give a whole new glove.
Yeah. So, but I don't know if we have any. I think we'd have to go back and make the photographs to be able to see if there's a sequence or something,
Yeah.
you know.
Or like see the progression from her first
Right.
design to where she got.
But that's, you know, I mean, I think however they came into being, it's clear that, you know, her vision was growing and developing, and so that's what's important. You know, it would be nice to historicize it, but I think the fact that they exist, and they exist as lots of different, you know, formations, is what to me is most important and interesting about it.
Can you run by me again, because I've forgotten how you said it? The Sunday hat again, I want to know.
Oh, okay.
I know
So-
everyone knows that.
Yes, it was, why do you have to sit in front of me hats? And that's a quote from the Crowns. The book is out of print, but you can get it like online, I think. You can still find copies of it. But it's a wonderful one. I know some of the people who are in there. And, you know, I keep bumping into people who say, oh yeah, did you see that? And as you saw from those exhibits, I mean, and actually if you go online, you can probably find some of these exhibits. Some of them are on YouTube, so they actually have recorded like the exhibits, or at least people talking about what they, you know, when they were in the exhibit. So it might be interesting to see, you know, what they're talking about. This one is actually fairly recent, the one from Records. This was a young woman, you know, who was doing some research and came across the hats and made that into a thing. So I just did like a search of exhibits on Black women's hats, or Black women's church hats, and came up with these. And as far as I know, there are about maybe 4 or 5, and so we now will join that in terms of the visibility, you know, of this exhibit.
I think about Jack McConnell and those hats that he made. I know Black women kept them in business.
Oh, yes.
Because if you had one of those prize hats, and they cost thousands of dollars,
Oh.
those women would buy those hats. And you could always tell a Jack McConnell hat. These hats are on the same level with his, but they were big, really big.
Those were, yes. The kind of hats of, what do you have to sit in front of me hats? Correct.
I used to call it preacher's wives hats.
Okay, yeah.
First lady.
First lady's hats, yes. Well, I want to thank you all for coming out and supporting me, but also supporting the exhibit. And I hope that you know there's another exhibit in tandem, a tip of the hat, where the curator, Rachel Young, has taken 11 African-American artists who have somehow used hats in their art. Okay, and it's throughout the museum. So the exhibit is there, but actually there's more going on that has to do with hats throughout. So this is a great time. I'm going to put in a pitch to like become a member, so you get advance notice of like things going on, but also to support the museum, because they've been doing great work with African-American artists and stuff. Thank you.